Hello and welcome to the CX Files podcast for June 23rd, 2022. My name is Mark Hillary and I'm in Sao Paulo, Brazil.
And I'm Peter Ryan. Usually, Mark, as you know, I'm in Montreal, but today I'm in another French-speaking city in the form of Brussels, Belgium.
And always nice to get out to Brussels. I certainly enjoy the mayonnaise on the chips there.
Now, the mayonnaise on the chips is always very good, as are a few Weiss beers that they do so well here in Belgium. Delighted to be back in Brussels. It's been a few years since I've had the pleasure, but this week I have traveled here for the Emerging Europe Summit that our friend Andrew Robel is putting on.
Excellent. Well, Andrew's always publishing good stuff on LinkedIn, so I'm sure that's going to be a great event. Well, we're actually talking to a European guest this week. We've got Stefan Freyer, who's the Managing Director of Orphoz. And Orphoz is a company that's owned by McKinsey. Of course, everybody will know McKinsey, the international advisory firm. Stefan's based in Berlin. And we talked about the gap between CX strategy and implementation, and he had a lot of great insight, as you might expect from anyone who works with McKinsey. He's talking really about the idea that we have a vision for CX, but then it doesn't follow through with the implementation. It's often a case of we'd love to do something, but then we look at the budget.
Yeah, and Mark, I think this is probably one of the biggest bugbears that I have had since I've been working as an advisor in the CX space, going back the past 2 decades. There's always great ideas that are thrown out on the boardroom table, but the ability to actually implement an idea is a very different thing. And I remember back in my MBA days when I was studying in the late 1990s, we had 2 classes, strategy formulation and strategy implementation. And I remember the professor who taught both of them was very adamant that the ability to actually take a plan and put it into practice was probably the biggest single challenge any organization, no matter what sector they were in, was going to have. And I think that in CX, this has certainly been the case, as you and I have witnessed it over the course of the past several years.
Yeah, I think one of the problems that traditional consulting firms have is that they sort of paint a vision of the future. It's like a future state. And they talk about there's a 2 or 3 year implementation plan to get to that future state. But then, stuff happens. The world changes, your business changes, and those 2 or 3 year plans can never actually be realized.
And this is the issue, I think, being able to understand that if you're going to put a plan in place, you've got to not just understand how it's going to impact the organization, but you're going to have to understand how the plan is going to be impacted itself by exogenous factors is absolutely essential. And again, this is what I think a lot of organizations that perhaps have a very inward-looking approach don't take into consideration. You've got to understand that all things are not going to be equal all the time. In a best case scenario, certainly, but how often do we have a best case scenario? And the best laid plans when it comes to CX that deserve to be implemented should be done so. But the only way that this can happen is if executives realize that there are going to be macro level factors that are going to have to be taken into consideration and adapt to those factors.
Well, Stefan's got some great points. He talks a lot about how do you focus on what really matters for your customers. So let's go straight to the interview with Stefan Freyer from Orphoz. Okay, great, Stefan. It's great to get you on the podcast. Now, I think all of our listeners are going to know McKinsey. It's one of the most famous and respected consulting firms globally, but Orphoz might be a new name. So maybe could you just introduce what you do and what is the connection to McKinsey?
Sure. Thanks for having me, actually. I'm happy to be here. Orphoz is it's an acronym for metamorphose. So that's basically where we are coming from, right? It's giving you an idea probably already. It's all about transformation and executing strategies, right? As you just mentioned, McKinsey is probably known for strategy consultancy, right? Basically, a strategy is a potential analysis, right? What we usually do is we look at operations, right? And the beauty of operations is it's straightforward. It's always similar things. You do it the similar way. And that way you always get a similar result, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean that you do it well. So the question is, what is the potential? How could you do better? And as soon as you know what the potential is, you know what could be the savings, additional revenues, higher customer satisfaction, higher employee satisfaction, whatever it is. But you need to get there, right? And that requires execution at the end. And we figured, and our clients asked us actually to support them in executing what we actually present them as a potential, right? And that requires, first of all, a high-level planning, and then setting up the project management and executing it, right? Project is a temporary organization. That basically means it's an organization within an organization for, well, a certain time frame, right? By definition, it's temporary, but it requires similar cross functions as any other organization, right? Finance, IT, legal, HR, all that needs to be organized. And of course, what is the topic of the project itself, right? So you have the work streams that need to be organized, and we make sure that everything is done according to plan, and that we also adapt plans where necessary to save the impact.
Okay. That's a good introduction. Now, I know that recently we had a conversation and we were talking about the difference between customer service and customer experience. And I know that, this is a common comparison that people make. A lot of analysts talk about it as the difference between the process of actually serving a customer, that kind of actual handling the calls, compared to the experience of a brand, every possible interaction with marketing, sales, customer service. But you described it in a very different way. It was like, are you looking out of a company from the inside, or are you on the outside looking in? So could you maybe explain this idea, please?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you already described what I was describing, right? I mean, customer service for me is more an inside-out view. It's usually operations based. It's usually based on the people running the service center and how to do that efficiently, basically, right? It is cost-driven in many cases, but it's not necessarily customer experience driven. Whereas customer experience, the CX view is an outside-in view. It is from the customer, from the client, basically, and the customer processes and use cases from customers and how they interact with the company. The two should be combined, though. I mean, the problem is if you look at only one way, from inside to out, or from outside to in, you're always missing something, because there's no, the two are no opponents, right? Customer and service organization have the same goals. When the customer is happy, he's not producing extra cost, right? The customer is not calling the service center in order to produce more costs, right? That's the wrong way of looking at it. The customer service is supposed to make the customer happy, solve their problems, basically. And if we do so, the customer will not only not bother us with contacts, but they will also increase revenue and buy again, basically, right? And there's nothing wrong with it. We all want to be happy customers at the end, right? We're all customers to any service. And if we just look at the service we would like to receive ourselves, right? That should be the goal, basically. And if we achieve that, we will have all the same goals, and we will have a very efficient and effective customer service running as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, effectively, to summarize, you mean that if I myself am looking at a brand, let's say a big bank, for example, I don't care about all the internal departments and operations within the company. For me, it's just one brand, and I interact with them. For example, I could respond to some advertising. I could respond to a sales call. I could actually initiate a call to customer service. But for me, it's always interacting with that one company, whereas within the company, there's a whole load of operations complexity.
Absolutely. Exactly that.
Yeah. Okay. That's pretty clear. I mean, but we've known about this for a long time. Brands have known about the importance of CX for so long. So why do you think that we're still talking about it? And even as we've been doing, still defining it and still defining the difference between service and experience today?
Yeah, you're so right. We're talking about it for at least 20 years. This is how long I've been in the business, right? I guess probably even longer. Customer experience, customer centricity, all those buzzwords, right? We always talk about the same thing, basically. So it is almost frustrating to see how little progress we made in that respect, really. From my experience, from what I see, I think what many companies are lacking are real power of implementation. At some point, you have a customer experience chain or process described. You have goals, you have targets, but then at the end, finance rules, right? You have all the processes, you know what to do, you have all the technology you need, and it's not that much actually to please a customer and to solve his or her problems. But at the end, you always tend to go back to a cost-driven, inside-out view, to look at it from a customer service perspective, from the operational perspective. Then you end up with, this is additional cost. This is an investment. Of course it is an investment, but it's not only investment in technology and change management and processes, it's an investment in actually growing your customer base and growing your customer relationship, right? And developing it well. There's so little instances when I've seen clients, companies looking at it that way. What is in for me? It's most of the time it's more, what does it cost me? And that's not the right way of looking at it, because would you actually ask marketing? Well, probably you do, and it's not a good thing either. But should we ask, what does the customer cost me? No, we should actually raise the question, what could we actually help the customer with in order to make him happy to buy from us?
Yeah, well, that's interesting, because I think that when I listen to all of the kind of CX influencers and experts and read the CX literature, everybody talks about there's a great ROI. You know, if you invest in better customer experience, there's always a great return. You get more revenue, more profit, etc. And yet, if we have that kind of experience and this these case studies that say investing in CX is good for the business, why is this strategy so far from what we see as the reality then?
In many cases, I've seen great strategies being developed, right? But then basically been thrown over the fence to someone else who was not catching it, right? And then starting all over with an implementation approach that was implicitly redoing the strategy again, right? But from the wrong end. I mean, in many cases, I see companies going in deeper and deeper in technical solutions, right? Trying to advance their IVR, their so-called AI, their voice response, but at the end, it doesn't save you anything and it's not pleasing the customer. So yeah, I think we do, again, we know what needs to be done and we have great strategies and we can develop even more great strategies, but at the end, and what we're really lacking is a proper implementation.
Yeah. I mean, have you had your own like personal experience then where, I mean, because as someone who's designing and implementing CX for a company like McKinsey, you know, you must have also thought in your personal life, you know, these people just don't get it.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioning it. Just recently I called my telecommunication provider. And by nature, my telephone number is transmitted, right? But the first thing I've been asked by the IVR is, please type in your mobile number, right? Okay, that was the first time I was, you know, kind of confused at least. But not only that, later on when I actually talked to the agent, the first thing he asked me was my customer ID. It's like, what the hell, you know? I mean, that is incredibly poor, to be honest, right? And that's one of the worst customer experience I've made just recently. Yeah,
and I've had my own experience with my bank as well. Very, very similar, where The IVR asks you to type in all the data, and when the agent answers, then they ask you to repeat it all again. It's just crazy. Okay, I mean, let's just look practically then, just to sort of finish up the conversation. I mean, clearly there's a gap between the strategy and the implementation. But if you're a CX executive, or if you are advising a CX executive, how can they close that gap between the vision of what they want to achieve and what can they practically do?
Yeah, I don't think we need to look for the next great thing. We don't need to look for the next terrific strategy, to be honest, right? Look at the essence of what we've already figured for many years, limited to the top 3 pain points, which in many cases are not, again, not highly sophisticated new telephony or IT systems, but it's the essence of how we handle our customers, how we would like to be handled and served as customers as a reference point, and be consequent in executing and implementing it, right? And don't get stuck halfway by looking at, oh, this is an investment in change management, this is producing costs. It's not producing costs, it's producing happy customers.
Thanks for listening to the CX Files podcast. We really appreciate your feedback and suggestions. You can reach myself, Mark Hillary, or Peter Ryan via LinkedIn. Please also leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast provider, as that helps more people to find us. As always, we'd like to thank Chris Haig at Traction Media for the CX Files graphics. See you next week.